I know that everybody loves writing learning objectives, so I'm going to give you a quick review of why we should write them and how to write good ones. So why do we even need to write learning objectives? Well, they enable you to focus on the skills that the learner needs to acquire. They provide a framework for you to develop this particular teaching session. They provide guidance for what and how you should evaluate areas after the session if you're going to do that. They make you limit content, so preventing you sending your learners into cognitive overload. And finally, if learners see them up ahead of time, it provides guidance to them for what's going to be in the session, areas they might want to prepare. So what's the usual process that happens when we write learning objectives? Well, first of all, we put our teaching session together. You think about what you know about this subject, you do some research, perhaps read some books, you find images, and then you make your slides. And then at some point, somebody asks you to please send 3 to 5 learning objectives for your session. To which you say, really? So then you look back at your session, you think, oh, what did I write about? What are they going to learn from me? How do I consolidate that into 3 to 5 sentences? And then you end up with something like this. During this lecture, I'll cover the etiology and anatomy of wherever, or during this lecture, you'll learn about the treatment of whatever. But this is the wrong way round. What we need is learner-centric teaching, not what do I want to teach during this session, but what do they need to learn. So teacher-centric teaching involves you asking questions such as, what should I teach? What will I cover? How will I cover it? But it's really not about you, it's about the learners. So questions that are more learner-centric are these such as, what should they know beforehand? What should they be able to do by the end of the session? How will my session guide them to achieve those goals? Learning objectives need to be smart. They need to be specific. They need to be measurable if you wanted to. They need to be attainable in that setting and time frame. They need to be relevant. And they need to be targeted to the desired level of teaching. You want to have them appropriate for junior residents or senior residents or CME, depending on the teaching group. For any teaching session, you will have a core objective, and then you will have a number of supporting objectives. Think of your core objective as your destination, and the supporting objectives of how you get to that destination. So here's an example core objective for a teaching session about contrast. By the end of this activity, learners should be able to appropriately manage patients in the prevention and treatment of adverse effects of iodinated contrast. To get to this core objective, we have these separate supporting learning objectives. Understand the etiology and consequences of adverse effects of iodinated contrast. Distinguish patients at high risk for contrast-induced nephropathy or contrast allergy. Protocol. Interpret variant, devise appropriate. You can read through these at your leisure. Notice that each of these objectives has an active verb associated with it. And these active verbs identify the skills that they should acquire. They help distinguish between lower and higher order learning, as we'll talk about in a minute, and they help lead to potential means of evaluation. For example, one of the learning objectives on the prior page talked about protocoling patients for IV contrast and pre-medication if necessary. So you can test your learners by giving them different patient scenarios that they then have to protocol. This is a list of verbs that are applied to Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives that you may be familiar with. You can have lower learning objectives, just memorizing information, compared to higher learning objectives where they understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, or create information. And we want our learners to be working their way towards the right-hand side of this chart. Each of these has a number of different active verbs associated with it, which you can use to help craft your learning objectives. This is another way of showing this skills pyramid with increasing complexity of tasks. So for example, taking our contrast example here, that knows lists common presentations of contrast reactions, knows how matches the presentation with the appropriate treatment, shows how identifies high-risk patients and protocols appropriately, and then does manages acute contrast reactions in a simulated environment. So what are our rules for writing learning objectives? It should be the first task in developing the session. So you do this before you make your slides. It's going to direct what the rest of the talk's going to be, or the rest of the active learning session. They should focus on necessary skills and knowledge. Generally speaking, you should not have more than about 5 per session, otherwise you're really going to send them into cognitive overload. Use active verbs, include some active verbs, some higher Bloom's levels, and you want them to be testable even if you're not going to test them. So theoretically, you should be able to test the learners if they acquire that information or that skill. So this is really the structure, particularly of the core objective, but really of any of the learning objectives. You don't have to write this each time, but at the end of every session, at the end of this session, the learner should be able to ... add your action verb there. You want to include the setting, so they're as specific as possible. And then you should critique them. Are they valid? Are they important? Are they meaningful? Do they really need to know this? Are they clear enough? Do the learners know what they should be able to do by the end of the session? Are they attainable or are they unrealistic? They may be unrealistic because of the time you have available to teach, of what you're teaching, or the group you're teaching to. They have to be targeted appropriately to the specific learner group or groups that you're teaching. And then finally, think about whether you can assess whether they have learnt this skill or knowledge. As I said, you don't have to test them, but would you be able to test them? I hope this has been helpful for you to learn how and why to write good learning objectives. Thank you for listening.